Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today in this module we are going to talk about environmental movements. This is the second part of the modules on environmental movements in the course Ecology and Society. In this module we will speak about the industrial disaster that took place at midnight on December 2nd, 1984 in the pesticide plant of Union Carbide India Limited in the city of Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh. This industrial disaster is considered as the worst industrial accident ever to have happened in the world. The purpose of the examination of this case for this module is to locate the struggle of the survivors of Bhopal in a broader context of a movement for environmental justice and corporate accountability in India. The Bhopal disaster is an instance of international environmental injustice and corporate impunity, and as the world's worst industrial disaster, it is an important global precedent in this context. The industrial disaster that took place at midnight on December 2nd, 1984 is considered the worst industrial accident ever to have happened in the world. The official figures recorded that 3,000 people died at that night, but unofficial estimates are about 8,000 to 10,000 deaths. Since then, the total death toll has risen to more than 30,000 over the years, which can be attributable to gas leak at Union Carbide plant, with people in Bhopal still dying as a result of after effects caused by chronic health conditions due to the gas leak and consumption of contaminated groundwater. This is a complex case involving critics by all parties like the NGOs, survivors and other public intellectuals who accuses the government of India, the US government and Union Carbide, now part of the Dow Chemical, of shirking off their responsibility during the disaster and as well as throughout the last 30 years. Large industrial companies such as Union Carbide invested in developing countries like India because it had cheap labor force and not very stringent regulations to limit business. Let's look at the history of this plant in Bhopal. The 1960s was a period when India tried to stabilize its agriculture sector after two droughts post 1947. The droughts caused widespread famine, leading to the introduction of a variety of grains from across the world. But with the introduction of these varieties of seeds, which were called high-yielding variety seeds, there was a need for pesticides and fertilizer that got increased, leading to Indian government to approve pesticide factories across India, one of which got opened in Bhopal, the capital city of Madhya Pradesh, in the year 1969. This plant produced carbaryl, also called savin. The first intermediate in this process was phosgene, which was produced by reacting carbon monoxide with chlorine. Phosgene in turn reacts with monomethylamine to produce methyl isocyanate, the lethal gas held in the storage tank, which leaked, resulting in the disaster on that fateful night. MIC is highly combustible, so it was kept under a nitrogen blanket in two storage tanks. It was highly ill-advised to store MIC on the side of the plant, as the plant was located among the densely populated areas of Bhopal. This site was originally rejected by the authorities of municipality of Bhopal. The city administrator and notifications were sent to the UCC official. But rather than following the directions, the administrator was transferred rather than the storage facility due to the pressure from the political class in Delhi. As a result of the malfunctioning of the valve, on the night of December 2nd, 1984, water entered the storage tanks where MIC was stored and reacted with nitrogen, leading to the leakage of MIC. Within 2 hours, the storage tank was empty. The gas leaked across the city, carried by winds to the slums inhabited by squatters in residential areas where people both poor and the rich lived, as well as the railway station, where at least 200 people were found dead, lying on the platforms the next morning. The wind blew the cloud of toxic gas over a vast area of nearly 40 square kilometers. The next morning, several thousand bodies were found lying in the street of Bhopal, with autopsies revealing necrotic fluid-filled lungs, and in some cases, holes appeared in the lungs due to reaction with MIC. To date, 30,000 were killed, and at least 6 lakh experience chronic illness. India today, in its edition in February 15, 1985 wrote, and I quote, the dead may not have been so unlucky after all. Their end came horribly, it is true, choking on air that had suddenly gone wild, but at least the nightmare was brief. And then it was over. For those who survived the poisonous methyl isocyanate leak from the Union Carbide plant, release will not come so quickly. Thousands of seriously affected survivors have suffered such extensive lung damage that they no longer can apply themselves physically. The vision often gets blurred, spells of dizziness overtake them, and walking briskly, even for a few minutes, sends them gasping to their knees, their chests aching. There are women who have peculiar gynecological problems, and there are others, particularly children, who keep reliving those hours over and over and over again, unquote. In the few years before the disaster, Union Carbide India Limited, UCIL, was losing money. During this period, safety and maintenance were made the lowest priority in an effort to turn around the profits from the plant. In October 1982, a mixture of MIC, chloroform and hydrochloric acid escaped from the plant. But despite this and the insistence of officials at the factory to increase safety measures, none of the safety measures and safeguards were put in place. Approximately one-third of engineers and specialists who were trained at the factory since its inception left for better jobs elsewhere before the accident. The question of the danger and the need to relocate the plant were put to the Assembly of Madhya Pradesh state government on December 1982, but was rejected by an official stating, I quote, "A sum of rupees 25 million were invested in this unit. The plant is not a small store which can be moved elsewhere. There is no danger of Bhopal, there will never be," unquote. Several factors have been identified by Lloyd Jones, Chawla and Shah, who wrote a book in 1996 on Bhopal disaster, as contributors to disaster. They were: 1. The gradual erosion of good and regular maintenance operations as part of cost-cutting measures. 2. The high attrition of trained professionals, especially in management positions. 3. Declining inventories of vital spare parts. And 4th, staff exodus and demoralization. And the 5th one that they identified was undermining of important workstations in the plant. Let's look at social, economic and environmental aspects of the Bhopal disaster. India, still a poor nation in 1984, also has its set of norms and tradition, with one of its inhuman one being the caste system and the treatment of women. These norms, based on the scriptures of Hinduism, in which the majority of people belong to the group of lower caste and ex-untouchable. The ex-untouchable are the most downtrodden Indian people and have politically organized themselves since the start of 20th century, adopting the term Dalit to refer to their communities. Even before the factory opened in Bhopal, people belonging to the lower caste communities began migrating from villages as the promised green revolution in agriculture, rather than supporting the small peasants, had pushed them to the brink of poverty, as mechanized agriculture was a more profitable option for the large landowning farmers. The small peasants moved towards cities like Bhopal and began squatting in vacant land around the cities, doing small businesses and working in odd jobs or as servants. These areas developed as shanty towns, which were considered to be vote banks for the major political parties, but bereft of any social security measures like electricity, water, sanitation, health centers and schools. This was the surrounding where UCC plant was set up. Delayed reactions to the disaster by the state administration, law and order agencies, UCC officials could have been due to the fact that most of the victims were people from these communities. Class action by the survivor of Bhopal gas disaster to the Supreme Court were also affected due to this factor. Union Carbide India Limited had the means and influence to hire the best lawyers. How could the poor afford the best? Moreover, even the distribution of compensation was affected by the rampant corruption in Indian bureaucracy. Even rupees 10,000 for the families of the survivor were not paid properly. Even the decision to authorize the agreement of $470 million by the government of India as representatives of the victim was made without prior consultation with the Bhopal gas victims. Dominic Lapierre, in his book 5 Past Midnight in Bhopal, that got published in 2002, reports a New York lawyer promising 100 million rupees in a meeting with the survivors, and while most of them then received only rupees 300, yet apparently the survivors were jubilant. After many years, while researching for the book, he met the same couple who had not received much compensation and were asking for at least an apology from Union Carbide. The social system of India contributed to the tenacity of relief and rehabilitation. The problems were exacerbated with the change in Western methods of thought, the work ethic and lifestyle, and Oriental. There was a lack of coordination by the Union Carbide officials in India and Danbury, the world headquarters of Union Carbide, in managing its operational details of the plant, as well as, most disturbingly, management of maintenance and safety. This is particularly important because Union Carbide promoted a story of sabotage by disgruntled employees. But details have not been tested or proven, and this was arguably a public relations spin by the company trying to distract attention from its culpability. Several studies published after the disaster note that the abnormal returns of the stocks had increased Union Carbide after a 1-month delay. This lag might not have contributed by the catastrophe, but previous events prior to the tragedy, such as profit for the corporation dropping and several takeover bids. For example, a failed takeover bid by GAF after a year of the disaster. The increase in the stockpiles was explained as a result of restructuring and recapitalization of the company before the sell-off. A study published in the Journal of Management Studies by Marcus and others in 1991 shows that stock prices react positively to the advocacy by the administration of a company in the case of a crisis, rather than accommodative move by managers towards the victims. This explains how managers try to divert the prosecution, suppress their personal human reactions to tragedy, and try to deny responsibilities. This can be used to answer the question why Union Carbide officials promoted a story of sabotage by a disgruntled employee or an attack by a Sikh terrorist. Shareholders see accommodative signals such as the settlement of $470 million as the acceptance of responsibility for the tragedy and react negatively, but could not reject their null hypothesis. In 1991, survivors and activists submitted to government data which showed that the plant was potentially leaking hazardous substances. In fact, the research laboratory of the state of Madhya Pradesh produced reports between 1991 and 1996, finding the water in the bastis near the abandoned factory site as unfit for consumption, but refused to warn residents, or government refused to release reports or act on their results. A provisional application filed by Bhopal Group for Information and Action indicates that the government agency, the Research Institute of the National Environmental Engineering, produced several reports about the plant which have been plagued by methodological problems and omissions. One funded by Everyday Industry India Limited, that is subsidiary trained in India by the division of UCC, famously said in 1997 that the pollution would take 23 years to reach the groundwater. Even Arthur D. Little, UCC's consulting firm, commented initially that NEERI's weakness, including standard sampling processes, and also expressed serious doubts as to the validity of NEERI's conclusions based on the inferior quality and misinterpretation of data. However, internal correspondence indicates that UCC chose to work with NEERI because they expected to have an opportunity to participate and put forward overviews during the progress of study and try to protect company's interests, unquote. Dow Chemical Company successfully subsumed Union Carbide on February 6, 2001 after Union Carbide became a wholly owned subsidiary of Dow. Dow owns all shares of Union Carbide but remained a separate entity. The company then maintained that shareholders of Dow and Union Carbide had no role in the tragedy. The details of these statements are explained in next section. Several residual environmental aspects persist in Bhopal 31 years after the tragedy. According to a study by Greenpeace, contamination of groundwater, soil and breast milk through drinking water pose a serious threat to health, not only for those who are currently exposed but also for the future generations. According to experts, evidence suggests that toxic chemicals not only have moved through different means, tropic transfer of these chemicals mainly through the food chain, the causes of these toxic substances becomes a part of the body burden. The survivors for long have been stating that the polluter pays policy and they till date continue to articulate that Dow Chemicals should take responsibility for the cleanup efforts in Bhopal. On the other hand, Dow Chemicals claim that they have no responsibility whatsoever in Bhopal. Lakshmi Murthy says in one of her articles, and I quote, "The post-Bhopal era also saw worldwide regulation on chemicals and toxicity, and a demand by communities to the right to information and to be participant in the process of industry setting. Unquote. However, as the report of Thomas McShane on the Union Carbide Corporation website says, I quote, "It is one of the bitter ironies of Bhopal that the major reformist efforts were felt in Union Carbide's home country." Unquote. Inspired by the disaster and public reaction to it, the United States has increased its regulatory activities. An important step was the establishment by the toxic release inventory and other measures of freedom of information. They increased significantly public access to information on emissions of toxic chemicals. In India, however, the struggles of the community have had little success in getting the right to know, where people can identify contaminated sites in their areas. A legal system in which residents is informed of the problems in this area is still in its infancy. In addition, most of the people in disaster area are poor and uneducated. They are not aware of the problems caused by exposure to the toxic waste at the site. Most residents are aware of the pollution of groundwater in the region. Others, although aware of contamination, continue to consume the local water because the government failed to provide alternative sources of drinking water. An article by a new web service in India states, "What about 700 tons of toxic waste in the form of corroded metal and other debris from Union Carbide now? They are dispersed and exposed on the premises of the factory and have aggravated the suffering of the victims who live nearby." Unquote. A scientific study undertaken by Greenpeace in 1999 and others by government agencies have confirmed the presence of several potentially lethal poisons such as mercury and other heavy metals, pesticides and chlorinated contaminations in the scattered debris at the factory site. The Greenpeace study, which also analyzed groundwater samples from sources which residents around the plant are using, revealed toxic contaminants, some of which are carcinogenic. These have been linked to chronic illness suffered by residents, some of which were listed at the beginning. The survey found 20 tons of hexachlorocyclohexane in bags dumped in open shed in an abandoned factory. HCH is a persistent organic pollutant and an environmental poison linked to immune system and reproductive disorders. According to a study by NIRI, Nagpur, the plant area recorded a high concentration of toxic waste, indicating the possibility of contamination at greater depths. Groundwater contamination was still to be discussed at this point of time. None of these reports, NGOs or government agencies, or the legal battles that have been ongoing for decades have brought a semblance of relief for the survivors. But despite all this, the survivors have organized into different groups. Bhopal Gas Pidit Mahila Stationary Karmachari Sangh, Bhopal Gas Pidit Mahila Udyog Sangathan, Bhopal Gas Pidit Mahila Purush Sangharsh Morcha, Bhopal Gas Pidit Nirashrit Pension Bhogi Sangharsh Morcha, Bhopal Group for Information and Action are several such organizations. And a recent organization that is called Children Against Dough and Carbide are some of the most important groups fighting for justice in Bhopal for the past 3 decades. The articulation of justice for Bhopal has led to more nuanced approaches since the 1990s. Let's talk about a campaign called No More Bhopals. During the first period of activism on Bhopal from 1985 to 1989, campaigns focused on local struggle for relief and rehabilitation, program of health, treatment and national and transnational campaigns focused on legal front against first Union Carbide in the United States, then in Indian courts. From 1989 to 1991, the campaign focused on legal and political fight against unfair regulations invented by Union Carbide and the Indian government. After 1991, the campaign relocated to a struggle for the disbursement of the remuneration to the survivor held in the grinding daily presence in the courts and offices of the bureaucracy of the state of Madhya Pradesh. It was followed by a phase that focused on health issues and treatment. First, to document the poor health status of ongoing gas health affected people, then set a clinic controlled by the movement. At the end of the millennium, there were significant developments in the country which, with the participation of a large international NGO, Greenpeace, and the production of research reports confirming the toxic contamination of groundwater and waste at the abandoned factory site. The campaign also revitalized the original guilty when Union Carbide was taken over by Dow Chemicals in 2001 and a new objective of the company became available. The campaign to force Dow Chemicals to take responsibility for Bhopal continues even today, accompanied by several attempts to force the Indian government to take responsibility for the Bhopal survivors. The beginning of this struggle goes back to December 3rd in the morning after the gas leak, where about 1,000 people organized and marched to the plant, which was still on fire. The next few months saw spontaneous demonstrations outside government offices, hospitals and relief camps that were organized mainly by local people with the support from many others who came from other parts of India to support the locals. In January 1985, 10,000 people planned to take over the Chief Minister's residence, demanding the elimination of toxic chemicals stored at the factory. The Chief Minister promised to create a team of scientists to investigate and take action, but no action was taken with respect to chemicals that were abandoned at the factory site. In April 1985, 300 pregnant women stood outside the hospital with their urine samples demanding testing of thiocyanate in their urine when they realized that the presence of the substance would affect their pregnancies. This led to the beginning of a long struggle carried out by members of affected community with a strong participation of women. Then on 1st June 1989, 75 women from Bhopal Gas Affected Women Stationery Workers Union began to march from Bhopal to Delhi. They demanded wages and salaries as regularized factory workers in the stationery shop where they were trained to produce paper products. They had discovered the provisions of Factories Act and Minimum Wages Act and were determined to get the legal dues for their work. Having not been able to get a job in the legal form of payment, they decided to march to Delhi to meet the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, even though they did not know the way. They decided to go even though they had not made arrangements for food and shelter along the journey. They did not have the means to inform either the press or the office of the Prime Minister about the trip. When they arrived in New Delhi after a march full of difficulties, they did not have the funds to stay there and did not know how to communicate with the Prime Minister. After investigation, they were told that the Prime Minister was away for the weekend and they will have to travel for another 10 days. Suresh Pachuri, a minister from their own state, came and assured them that once back in Bhopal, their problems would be solved and promised to personally take care of the case and get their demands met. He persuaded the women to return to Bhopal. With the guarantee of the minister, the women decided to go back home. The promises were not fulfilled. Later, Rajiv Gandhi visited Bhopal to address a public meeting. Women stormed it despite police attempts to stop them. They interrupted the meeting and placed their complaints in front of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, and they finally won the victory of 100 women getting rupees 2,000 as regular salaries. The 2000s saw two more Padyatras in the year 2006 and 2008, the demands for which were clean and uncontaminated drinking water, cleanup of the factory site by Dow Chemical Corporation, a higher compensation, and to hold Dow Chemicals accountable for environmental crimes they are responsible for after taking over Union Carbide Corporation in 2001. The gas disaster survivors were relentless during the last 30 years in campaigning at local, national and international level for justice in Bhopal and holding Union Carbide Corporation and Dow Chemicals responsible for the disasters and making them pay for cleaning and accepting responsibility for the disaster. The tragedy of Bhopal and the long fight for justice made the Indian government strengthen environmental laws for the approval of draft standards for plant emissions and effluents. Statements prepared by expert committee should in future contain expert analysis on the ecosystems and management of water resources, control of air pollution and water, flora and wildlife conservation, planning and land use, social science, ecology and environmental health. Now to conclude, Bhopal activism at its best represents Bhopal as an ongoing catastrophe defying platitudes about poverty, health, justice and the permissible parameters of corporate behavior. Effective campaigns aside, however, Bhopal is still in crisis. Initiatives such as those carried out by Sambhavana Clinic and Permanent People's Tribunal that functions as examples and opportunities cannot replace the operation of national and international structures. Groups in Bhopal have struggled to avoid losing their rights by developing broad support across borders and constantly challenging the government of India to proclaim their responsibilities to the survivor and place responsibility on Dow Chemicals and Union Carbide where it belongs. In this long and sad story, hope is bigger than ever that these two possibilities will become a reality. Bhopal is both exemplary and exceptional, and unfortunately reflected at different scales on the experience of millions of people worldwide. Therefore, it is crucial to understand the problems that were made explicit in the various responses to the Bhopal disaster, as a sophisticated balance of these tensions is still necessary to devise permanent solutions. First, the lack of government and corporate responses helped fuel a global discourse of rights among the survivor groups, which resulted in the transformation of their own sense of rights and necessitated them to focus on their resilience with experience and anger towards the global targets that embody injustice and impunity. Second, to try to overcome the fundamental structural inequalities that established, and it could be argued caused, the disaster. Survivors and activists found themselves trapped in the alternation of these structural frameworks and singularly launched to subvert and change them through democratic processes. The problems and the rewards of translation between the cultures and classes and the subversion of the legal and scientific organizations, Bhopal was marked as a place of global innovative communications, community health activism. Finally, Bhopal survivors and activists have reshaped the terms of engagement both in chemistry and corporate strength and consistently refute government and the efforts of companies to define the disaster as a discrete event and effectively strengthen to reclaim and articulate against DOE and UCC in the same time as they try to dissolve their responsibility. Bhopal illustrates the consequences of a model of progress and a global system in which governments still prefer to collect the cost of the rehabilitation of an industrial disaster rather than taking action against the perpetrators. Under pressure from activists, the Indian government finally appears to be acknowledging that development comes at a cost, and if they try to avoid development problems, they will be responsible to pay it if they cannot regulate foreign players. Thanks.